It looks kinda like milk. Laura's face stretched into a smile. She began to laugh, her teeth peeking from behind her small lips. The town was shrouded in a thick fog that blurred everything into white, as if she were in some sort of magical land. Sometimes Laura liked to think that some scatterbrained god had carelessly dropped his cup and spilled his morning milk all over the place. The mysterious atmosphere could be a sign that there were fairies or something hiding out there. The thought made Laura's heart tremble with excitement. The 8-year-old girl began to playfully hop and skip along, her skirt fluttering behind her. Slowly and smoothly, the fog flowed and drifted through the air. "Come on, hurry up, I'm gonna leave you behind," Laura shouted over and over again, calling out to her companion. The two of them were here because they were on a journey to find their friends. Only he was fat and a bit thick-headed. Sometimes all he did was mope around, and he always seemed to be scowling. But Laura didn't care too much. She could put up with him if it meant seeing her again soon. The person who gave her that letter. On the other side of the dirty clouds was a vision of himself. Reflected in the mirror was his own face, stiff and lifeless as a corpse. Actually, I guess I am dead, James Sunderland thought. My heart's as good as dead anyway. He wasn't filled with a sense of loss. He just felt like his life wasn't worth living anymore. He had become indifferent. Work, free time, none of it really mattered anymore. Even the strongest scent of ammonia that permeated the filthy little room couldn't catch his attention. The dirty urinals caked with a yellow moss-like substance, the sticky wet floor that had soaked into the soles of his shoes. None of it brought a change in his emotion. Mary, could you really be in this town? He asked the James in the mirror. He had doubts about the incident. Did it really even happen? But with his hands on the sides of the wash bin, he peered into the mirror. Despite his attitude, he felt the tiniest spark of hope. He shook his head and brushed the bangs from his face, like waking from a delusion. He knew it was really true, because it came in a letter. He stepped out of the gloomy building and gazed up at the cloud-filled sky. A damp wind brushed James's cheek. Across the parking lot was the vast Toluca Lake, mist dancing on its surface and stretching over the entire horizon. In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised me you'd take me there someday again, but because of me you were never able to. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you. There was no doubt that Mary had sent this letter. It was written in her familiar handwriting. 3 years ago he had spent a holiday with her in this small town, and now James was here again, alone. His car sat in the corner of the small parking lot, its engine idling. Even though it was in perfect working order, it wouldn't be of much use any further. The highway was a real problem. The tunnel at the far end of the parking lot that led into the town was blocked off by a sturdy fence, and there was no choice but to find another way around. After retrieving a map of the town from his car's glove box, James descended his stairway at the edge of the parking lot. With each downward step, the fog thickened. By the time he reached the lake shore, his entire field of vision was shrouded in white, unable to see more than a few feet in front of him. More and more, James was beginning to feel an unnatural, suffocating feeling. However, in this oppressive atmosphere, his mind was occupied by thoughts of Mary and the letter. Somewhere off, far in the distance, a dog was barking like crazy, but he couldn't register that. He sank into a grave mood, stomping over the ground as he continued to walk. The letter certainly had Mary's name written on it. What a foolish, impossible idea. His brow furrowed, and he shook his head in disbelief. It couldn't be true, because his wife, Mary, had died 3 years ago because of her illness. It was such a cruel joke, a joke played to mock James, even though he was still heartbroken and grieving. Maybe it was one of his neighbors, or perhaps it was probably one of his co-workers. After he had lost his wife, James took to drinking and began to conceal his sorrow with outbursts of anger. It affected everyone around him to the point that his coworkers didn't want to put up with his sullen behavior. Before long, he was treated like a troublemaker. For that reason, he could easily see how someone could hold a grudge against him. Extending along the lake, the end of the path was surrounded by trees and dense fog. Even after just a few yards, he couldn't see the overlook from which he had started. At the head of the valley, the mist also hid Toluca Lake's magnificent scenery, but James could care less. He didn't come here to sightsee. As he walked, all he could picture was Mary's face, even if James still had his doubts about the letter. It, along with the memories of his beloved wife, was what had brought him this far. It was no wonder, then, with these kind of thoughts in his head, that James found himself wishing for some form of miracle. Did she really die 3 years ago? Or had she died and somehow been revived? Perhaps after the funeral, and after the workers and mourners left the grave unattended, Mary woke up and began desperately beating the lid of her coffin? But if that were true, why would she have waited 3 years to contact him? He considered the possibility that she received brain damage due to asphyxiation and suffered memory loss as a result. The workers would have fled in terror at seeing a supposedly dead person move around, leaving her without any idea of who she was or what she was doing there, to unsteadily wander off somewhere else. It might have even scared James at first. Or perhaps, maybe, he thought, she could have been kidnapped by some ill-intentioned gravedigger. James ground his teeth in frustration. The noise of the dead leaves scattering along the path crunched louder as he carelessly trampled over them. It was irritating how his imagination kept spewing forth one unpleasant scene after the other, no matter how hard he tried to stop it. In any case, there was one thing he hadn't been able to prove: whether or not Mary was even alive in the first place. Still, James found that he was afraid to find the answers to that question. But if she really has been alive this whole time and didn't try to contact me until now, maybe she's been trying to avoid me? What if she ran off and has been living with another man? Those kind of thoughts crossed his mind as well. Women's hearts were so difficult to understand. For a moment, he felt a burning surge of hatred, but it soon drowned in his melancholy mood. More than anything, he just wanted to see her again, and more than anything else above that, he dreaded that meeting as well. Forcing back his hesitation, James pressed on, putting one foot in front of the other as if sleepwalking. Suddenly, James came to a halt and held his breath. In front of him, a human-shaped silhouette could be seen in the fog. Could it be Mary? Naturally, it wasn't James's wife. Looking closer, he found a dark-haired woman standing still and staring pensively at a gravestone. Without even noticing it, James had wandered into a cemetery. Sensing his presence, the woman let out a gasp of surprise and spun around to face him. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I'm looking for a town called Silent Hill. Would you mind telling me if I'm going the right way? Town? You're going to the town? The woman tilted her head doubtfully, the surprise on her face even greater than when she first noticed him. Though she still had youthful features, dark, heavy circles hung like deep shadows under her eyes. Yeah, James replied. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if contemplating whether or not to answer, but then answered after a minute. Yeah, that's the right way. I know it's a bit hard to see, because of the fog, but there's only one road, so you really can't get lost. Thanks, but what is it? It would be best if you didn't go any farther. Huh? Because that town is a strange place. I can't really explain it well, but it's dangerous there. Just because of all this fog? She stuttered. Well, not just that. It just is. What was she thinking of that made her words seem so heavy? It didn't look like she was going to be saying anything else, so it seemed pointless to try and get the answer from her. James sighed and motioned toward her. "I got it. I'll be careful." "Hey, I'm not making this up," the woman yelled as James was about to walk away. "I came to this town because I need to find my mama. I haven't seen her in a long time, and this town..." Her voice was hysterical now, almost crazy. James wasn't sure what made the woman, who had barely spoken above a whisper, scream like this. Clearly she had issues that needed to be worked out. Then again, the same could be said for him too. Deciding it was best not to worry about that for the moment, James just ignored it. Not to say James didn't believe what the woman told him, but if he wanted to see Mary, he would just have to keep going despite the danger she kept trying to warn him of. Walking past her, James passed through the graveyard and found his way back to the path that stretched and wove through the forest by the lake. Again, his thoughts turned to Mary. Her letter had said, "I'm waiting for you in our special place." But what did she mean by that? He tried to search through all the buried memories from 3 years ago, when they had first visited the small town. The two places that stood out the most from his memory were the park and the hotel. He remembered how the two of them had spent a great deal of money to book a deluxe suite, and how they ordered extravagant meals from room service. One day, while they were strolling around town, they happened to find the park by the lake. The couple had sat on a bench together, watching the boats sail back and forth over the shimmering waters. They ended up staying there all day, just enjoying the scenery and each other's company. But the question still remained. Was Mary waiting for him at the park or the hotel? Before long, the sound of dead leaves crunching underfoot stopped, and the dirt path gave way to an old asphalt road. The road led to a tunnel that ran under the highway that would have made his journey faster and easier, if only it hadn't been closed. James continued along intently as the street curved and followed along a river, finally reaching the town's main street. James pulled out and began to examine his map. It looked like he was traveling along Sanders Street, which is located at the town's eastern border. If he continued west from here, he should have been able to reach the center of town. James' footsteps echoed ominously as he proceeded down the empty street. In fact, his footsteps were the only sounds he heard. None of the normal noise of a bustling town seemed to be present. Granted, it was a pretty small town, but this kind of unbroken silence just felt unnatural to him. With the place being covered with as much fog as it was, you'd have a hard time seeing anything if you drive through it, let alone walking. It made sense that the schools and businesses would be closed and everyone would be holed up in their homes waiting for the weather to improve. That being the case, his chances of taking a cab were looking pretty slim. James sighed. On the bright side, even if he had to walk, the park was only about a half hour away. Nevertheless, he still worried about Mary and hoped that wherever she was, she'd still be there, so this whole journey wouldn't be in vain for him. When James approached the intersection at Lindsay Street, he caught sight of something disturbing. Large red streaks painted the asphalt road in front of him. James recoiled in shock. Seeing something so closely related to death opened emotional wounds for him. He stood dumbfounded for a moment, eyes locked on the blood-red stain. From the looks of it, it was still pretty fresh. Clearly a terrible crime had been committed under the cover of this fog, but no matter where he looked, he saw no trace of a victim, aside from the blood. It doesn't look like anyone was taken to a hospital. If that was the case, the police would have had this area blocked off. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, or rather, the sound of what's flesh slapping against the pavement. Looking ahead, James spotted a blurry human figure stepping off into the depths of the fog. "Hey!" James began to chase after it. Ever since he lost his wife, he had always been indifferent to the rest of the world, and as much as he wanted to just walk away and forget he ever saw the blood-stained pavement behind him, this was something he just couldn't let go. There was no way he could just bring himself to abandon someone who's probably dying, given the amount of blood the person obviously left behind. This guy's probably some kind of thug who got in a fight and was now wandering around town half-conscious and badly bleeding, and apparently without shoes. No matter how much James yelled and called, the fleeing figure would not stop. Maybe the person mistook him for his attacker? Despite the figure's staggering gait, he moved pretty quickly, and the distance between them grew more and more with every step. As he fled, a trail of speckled blood was left on the road behind them, going north to the end of Lindsay Street, then sharply turning right. The trail continued in a northeastern direction to Nathan Avenue, the main road that led out of town. James was led to an unpaved road, lined on both sides with tangled barbed wire fences, just like a construction site, leading to a half-finished tunnel just like the one he had passed through earlier. Naturally, there wasn't a worker in sight. The figure he'd been chasing was nowhere to be found as well. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the tunnel entrance. Though this place was clearly meant to be off-limits, the only thing blocking the way was some scrap wood nailed to the tunnel entrance to form a crude barricade, which was easy enough to slip through for him. On the ground sat a small pocket-sized radio. Probably belonged to one of the construction workers so he could listen to music while working, but why was it left here? James flicked the switch into the on position, and immediately the radio let out a deafening blast of white noise which not only hit his ears, but seemed to hit him deep within his body and his soul as well. At that moment, an unreasonable but compulsive idea echoed through his mind. I haven't touched the volume, but the static, it's getting louder. The sound of feet walking over rubble and debris steadily moved closer. Out of the depths of the tunnel emerged a staggering figure. James started to worry, as it became clear that this was certainly the thing that led him here. But whatever the thing was, it sure as hell wasn't human. The creature's arms seemed to be fused into its body with mottled, rotting flesh, and it completely lacked eyes, a nose, a mouth, and anything that could possibly identify it as a living person. The monster stumbled forward drunkenly, while its upper body twitched and writhed in a strange dance. It didn't seem to be injured, so how the heck did it leave a trail of flesh blood? Clearly this wriggling monster wasn't the victim, but the assailant. His whole body now shaking, James began to slowly back up in retreat. Terrified as he was more concerned about letting the thing get anywhere near him. He wanted to escape. He wanted to run away. It would be so easy to just turn around, climb back through the barricade, and run. But he didn't. Turning around, he ripped an old board from the barricade and, full of rigor and rage, held it up as a makeshift weapon. Why he had chosen to do such a reckless and stupid thing, he wasn't thinking of. He couldn't just stand and let that twisted creature exist anymore. He couldn't leave a dangerous monster to wander around and cause any more harm. However, the true reason he hated this thing had nothing to do with any false sense of justice or moral. It was disgust. Gathering up all his strength, James swung the plank, aiming for the writhing monster's head. The creature recoiled, and despite not having a mouth, let out a piercing screech. Again and again he swung the plank until he lost count of how many times he had struck the thing, and his arms became sore and tired. Badly injured, the monster fell to the ground, landing where its arm should have been on the scattered debris. Despite the beating it took, it still twitched and wriggled on the ground. Then finally, it grew still. Is it dead? Just to be safe, James nudged it with the wooden board. No sign of movement. Now that it was lying on the ground in a pool of blood like this, it looked more like a slug than a human being. Its featureless face was smashed pretty badly, and it was leaking spinal fluid everywhere. There was no doubting it. This thing was dead. What the hell was that thing anyway? No matter how we looked at it, no matter how we tried to rationalize the existence of that monster, nothing made sense. Could it be some kind of crazy, screwed-up test subject that escaped from a lab? He toyed with similar possibilities in his head. He tried as hard as he could to believe them. James shook off the useless guesses and tossed aside the blood-soaked plank. He was about to slip back through the barricade and leave the tunnel when the radio caught his attention. He regarded it with suspicion. When the creature had come into sight, the radio was blaring with white noise, but now that the thing was dead, it had fallen silent. Suddenly, it began to flicker to life again. James looked around, worried that it was somehow announcing the presence of another monster, but it sounded different. If he listened carefully, he could just make out a woman's voice. James gasped. Mary! That was Mary's voice. Turning around, he quickly picked up the radio and listened closely. Mary's voice calling to him between the bursts of static. I'm come to what submits in why did you get me? James held the radio speaker closer to his ear, trying to piece together or hear more, but his wife's voice had faded away, and all he could hear now was small crackling static. He hit it once or twice, and turned all the switches on it, but no matter what he did, the voice never came back. Giving up, he put the radio in his jacket pocket and left it in the on position just in case. As he walked, James considered the options. Perhaps Mary had made it to the town's radio tower, which was trying to get a message to him. Maybe the real purpose of her letter was to get him close enough to town to pick up this signal. But if that were true, why didn't he get it on his car radio on the way over here? And how come this stupid broken radio was the only thing picking it up? James had retraced his steps until he made it back into the town, and then he started to make his way toward the Woodside Apartments building. When Mary had spoken to him through the radio, he thought he could just barely make out the name of the building. However, there was a slight problem. He had no idea where the apartment building was. He had checked his map of Silent Hill more than once, but it wasn't marked anywhere. No symbols, no names, nothing. With any luck, he would run into one of the town's residents soon so he could ask for directions. James began walking north up Lindsay Street, then went west at Nathan Avenue. Just to the north of Nathan Avenue was one of their special places, Rosewater Park. Since he wasn't having any luck tracking down the apartment building, he would have to make his way toward the park for now. When suddenly, James noticed two people emerging from an alley ahead of him. Great, now he could probably get some directions. Hey, you, over there! He yelled to get their attention and quickly started running to meet up with them. However, he stopped dead in his tracks when a familiar noise started coming from his jacket pocket. The radio had crackled to life and was emitting static again. Unfortunately, his yelling had caught the attention of the monsters, and the blurry figures had turned to face him. As they approached through the fog, it was becoming more and more clear that something was very wrong. As they walked, they twisted and writhed about in a most unnatural way. He was right. They were monsters too. Exactly the same as the one he had killed earlier. Did a whole group of these messed up things escape from some kind of lab? Even now, just watching the things thrash in agony brought back the same feelings of hatred and disgust he felt. He wanted to destroy them, smash their heads in like the other one. Anything to end the existence of these awful abominations. James realized suddenly that he had abandoned his weapon, the wooden plank. For a moment, he considered just using his fists, but the thought of actually touching their repulsive flesh sent chills down his spine, causing him to actually shake his shoulders. More importantly, he had the disadvantage of being outnumbered 2-1. Maybe this time it would be best to avoid unnecessary conflict. Having quickly made up his mind, James wasted no time and turned, running south before the creatures could stagger any closer. He ran to Cat Street, a road which ran east to west right through the center of town, and then took a detour onto Neely Street. Their jerky movement seemed to slow the monsters down, and with each turn they fell further and further behind until they were swallowed up into the fog. As he ran, James noticed that he was further away from the pursuing monsters, the softer the radio static became. Could it be responding to the presence of the creatures? How the heck could a broken radio do something like that? Whatever the reason, it could help him protect himself, which meant it was definitely worth having around just in case. However, even though the monsters had fallen behind and were nowhere to be seen, the radio still wasn't completely quiet as it was when he killed the first one. He ran straight through the intersection of Martin and Cat Street, passing over the crossroad at Neely Street soon after. He just had to keep running forward. He now had his eye on Munson Street because he had crossed Neely Street. He had spotted another creature coming at him from the middle of the road. "What the hell?" James shouted in disbelief. These things were wandering around all over the place. Have they taken over the town or something? Could these be the town's people? Now Cat Street seemed to be occupied with the armless creatures as well, leaving him nowhere to go. James stood paralyzed with horror and could only stare at the twisted shadows dancing in the fog. Even if he tried running again, there was no way he could make it back to Nathan Avenue past these things. In a moment of desperation, he was reminded of the warning the woman in the graveyard had given him. At the time, he thought nothing of it and didn't take it too seriously. But now he was starting to regret it. He should have listened to her. He should have turned around and ran away when he had the chance. Even after encountering the first monster, he should have just left the crazy town. But he couldn't. His desperate search for Mary, his wife, his dead wife. He just couldn't give that up. Just the thought of seeing her again, even just once, was enough to make him continue on, even now as things were becoming more dangerous. She was the reason why, no matter what, he had to live. Even if it meant risking his life, he couldn't just stand here and die. To hell with it then. James charged forward, praying he'd be able to find a gap between the monsters, or that he'd be able to shove one aside and make it past the converging mob. The moment he approached the first twisted body, the fog seemed to change color before his eyes, and his mouth and nose began to burn with an acrid, rotten smell, such as sulfur. Having momentarily lost his focus, he ran straight into one of the monsters and was sent spiraling in the other direction, hitting the pavement hard. He was suddenly struck with a violent coughing fit and his mouth felt numb, as if he'd been injected by some anesthetic or something. It was a poison. Now these vile creatures were spewing poison into the air. How the heck could they spew poison if they didn't have mouths? As another monster stumbled towards him, into his visible spectrum, he looked up to see that its body was split by a cavernous vertical crack running from its neck to its waist, its dark, wet entrails fully visible. The creature bent backwards, as if it was taking a breath from this bizarre second mouth. James had a feeling that it was preparing to spray more of the awful acidic poison, but he wasn't able to stick around to find out. Swinging his leg like an axe, he kicked the monster's legs as hard as he could, knocking it off its feet and leaving it squirming around on the pavement. Its lack of arms caused it to thrash about helplessly as it tried to find a way to stand upright again. Quickly pulling himself to his feet, James began to kick the creature while it was distracted. "Just die already!" His heavy boots easily broke through its soft skin, leaving them covered in sticky red body fluid from the monster. The creature shrieked and convulsed with every impact made upon its flesh. Twisting around, it began to violently thrash its legs, enabling it to crawl across the ground. At first, James thought it was trying to escape, but in one quick movement, it twisted around in a U-turn and flung itself straight at him. The bastard was trying to counterattack. James was beginning to feel quite sick. His whole body was shaking, and he was beginning to feel dizzy, no doubt because of the poison that he had inhaled earlier. This was bad. If he didn't get away from here soon, he wasn't sure how much longer he'd last. He took a shaky step backwards, and his back hit against the chain-link fence, causing it to rattle. Wait, could this be a gate? James turned and saw that there was indeed a gate he was against. He pushed it open and hurried to the other side, then flung it closed and locked, putting the chain-link wall between him and the writhing monster. Behind him sat a 3-story-high wooden apartment building, its old boards and peeling paint showing its age. Next to the entryway was an equally old plate which read, Woodside Apartments. He had found them.